Welcome to my channel. I'm Gary Wiryawan, and today we're going to talk about this little telephoto lens right here. This is the Panasonic Lumix 35-100mm f4 to f5.6. Let's go! So today we're going to talk about the Panasonic Lumix 35-100mm f4 to f5.6. I bought this lens in 2016, but back then I didn't really use this lens that much. I think it's just another telephoto lens that's just not really that useful in my opinion. However, these last few months I've been trying to do this everyday photography challenge for myself, where I try to find something interesting every day and try to come up with a nice photograph of those subjects, and I ended up bringing this lens a lot, and I've been enjoying this lens so far. So today I want to share a little bit of my experience as well as a little bit of my review of this 35-100mm lens. Anyway, you can check out my everyday photography vlogs up here in the card, and basically those are all the videos that I do where I try to challenge myself to once again try to find something interesting almost every day and try to come up with a nice photograph of these subjects. And undoubtedly I featured this lens on a lot of these videos. Anyway, the 35-100mm, I think it's another Micro Four Thirds classic lens. Well, it's not really that old because it was introduced when the GM1 comes out, if I'm not mistaken. But basically this is another favorite of mine because you can cover a telephoto focal length with just a such small and lightweight lens. I am always a big fan of anything that is small, that is lightweight, but can produce great image quality. And also I think that the 35-100mm lens is a prime example of the original Micro Four Thirds philosophy. Small, lightweight, compact, easy to carry around, but it can produce great image quality as I mentioned before, and also affordable. The 35-100 was originally meant to be paired with the Panasonic 12-32mm kit lens, and both of these lenses are designed to be used with smaller Panasonic Micro Four Thirds cameras. Now I want to talk about the exterior of the 35-100mm lens, and the first thing that you're going to notice is that this lens is very small. It is as small as the original 14-42mm kit lens from Panasonic, and that lens is also small. So yeah, for a telephoto lens of this size, this is kind of magic. If you own the Panasonic 12-32mm kit lens, you'll also notice right away that the 35-100mm is very similar to the 12-32mm lens. Both of these lenses have similar material, both of these lenses have similar appearance as well. They look almost the same, but the 35-100 is slightly taller. And also I really think that they're both meant to be paired together, as I mentioned earlier. Also, just like the 12-32mm, the 35-100mm is a collapsible lens, meaning that if you want to use the lens, you have to unlock the zoom barrel first, and then you can start to choose the focal length, the zoom range that you want, just like the 12-32 really. I think one of the difference of the 35-100 and the 12-32mm is the manual focus ring. The 35-100 has a manual focus ring right here, and the 12-32 doesn't. Anyway, I don't really use the manual focus ring that much because I found that the autofocus performance of this lens is good, but I will talk about the autofocus later on. Other than the zoom barrel and the manual focus ring, there's nothing really going on with this lens. There's no like focus selector switch, there's no image stabilizer switch. It's just a simple, clean, minimalist design, and it's just a very straightforward lens to use. So yeah, overall first impression of this lens when it comes to build quality and exterior, it's just a solid, minimalist, simple, clean lens. However, keep in mind that this is an affordable budget lens, so they have to sacrifice something, and on this lens you won't get weather sealing. So be careful when using this lens on a weather that is less than ideal. Now let's quickly talk about the basic specification of the 35 to 100mm lens. So first I want to talk about the zoom range. This lens can cover anything between 35 to 100mm. So this is kind of a basic telephoto lens similar to the full frame equivalent of 70 to 200mm telephoto lens. The aperture of this lens goes from f4 at 35mm all the way to f5.6 at 100mm. Not really a large aperture, this is kind of small and narrow, and that means that for lower light situation it's not going to be ideal. Other basic specification of this lens that I want to mention is that this lens has an image stabilizer, and that is really nice because usually with budget telephoto lens you don't always get image stabilizer. Also, the filter thread diameter is about 46mm, so you can use a polarizer or ND filter of that size. So now I want to talk a little bit about the usage of this lens. And first, with the combination of this zoom range and aperture, I think most people would want to try to use it for portrait if you don't mind slightly less than ideal background blur. But definitely you can use this for portrait. I personally used this lens a couple of times for portrait, and I think I got good result with this lens, although I cannot really blur the background as much as with the other lenses that I already have. I also use this lens a few times for anything that requires close-up photography such as flower photography, and I think I got good result from it. So any general kind of photography that require close up, tightness, and a little bit of zoom, you can really depend on this lens as well. However, I personally think that this lens really shines when it comes to landscape photography. Wow, this is just such a perfect lens for that tighter landscape composition shots. I use this lens a lot for landscape photography, and I think I got good result with this lens, especially when I want to photograph far away mountain, volcanoes, that kind of stuff. I think this lens really shines. Also, just overall landscape photography with slightly zoomier composition as opposed to the traditional wide angle composition, I think this lens can really deliver. Another scenario where I think that the 35 to 100mm lens will shine is travel photography. As you all know, when you're traveling by a plane, you have that 7kg carry-on weight limit, and carrying a big bulky telephoto lens is always a nightmare. It will quickly eat up that 7kg weight limit, and also it will take so much room inside your carry-on bag. So this lens at only 135 grams, I think is very lightweight, and you can always pack this lens for travel and you will never miss that telephoto shots anymore. I think this lens can also be potentially used for a little bit of wildlife photography, but in my opinion, 100mm is not really that long for a telephoto lens, so you'd be better served with other longer lens rather than the 35 to 100mm for wildlife photography. Now let's talk about image quality. And speaking about image quality, this lens is fantastic. It has decent amount of sharpness. It is very contrasty. The edge to edge sharpness is just perfect. There's no weird vignetting going on. I think for a lens of this size and price, I think this is just such a total winner. Speaking about sharpness, I did a test of telephoto lenses a few months before. You can check out on the card above right here. But basically, the 35 to 100mm lens is quite a nice performer in this sharpness test. I'm also very happy to report that the autofocus performance of this lens, especially in single autofocus mode, is very reliable. It can lock almost instantaneously at any kind of subject, and that makes this lens a really good performer. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this lens features an image stabilization, and that is really great because most budget telephoto lenses don't always feature image stabilizer. And although the image stabilizer is not really that advanced, it doesn't have that dual IS Panasonic feature, but it's still a solid performer. I can get down to about 1/15 of a second without any problem, but anything lower than that you have to really be careful when you're hand holding this lens. Now let's talk about some negative points of this lens, and frankly speaking, I cannot really find that many negative points about this lens, and the only nitpick that I have about this lens is the aperture. I wish that this is not an f4 to f5.6 but a constant f4, but again, this is a budget lens and doing so might probably increase the cost as well as the size and the weight, and that will not make the lens attractive anymore. So yeah, I'm quite happy with this lens. I don't think there's really any flaw with this lens at all. Now let's talk about some alternative lenses for the Panasonic 35-100 f4 to f5.6, and the first lens that comes in mind is the Olympus 45mm f1.8. This is such a nice lens. This is also as small, if not smaller than the 35-100mm lens. This has larger aperture of f1.8. However, it only has a single focal length, 45mm. It's not a zoom lens, and I think this is much better for portrait, especially if you want to get that background blur with the f1.8 aperture. I think this is a better choice than the 35-100mm. However, for a more flexible kind of lens, I still think the 35-100mm lens is a winner right here. Next alternative to the 35-100 f4 to f5.6 definitely is its bigger brother, the 35-100mm f2.8. This is such a big lens, but this is a professional lens. This has an aperture of f2.8, constant aperture. It's not going to change when you zoom in or zoom out, and also it has weather sealing. It's a pro grade lens. However, this is much bigger, much heavier, so maybe this is not something that you will take on travel. You will much prefer the f4 to f5.6 for travel, but this is more flexible when it comes to usage, because with the large aperture you can use this lens for lower light situation as well as for more background blur, especially for portraits. Another alternative is the Panasonic 14-140mm f3.5 to f5.6. So the 35-100 is only a telephoto lens. If you need something that can do it all, then the 14-140mm is your answer. This is such a versatile, flexible, and very practical lens, because you can just zoom out to 14mm, a moderately wide angle focal length, and you can zoom in all the way to 140mm, which is more zoomed in than the 100mm of this lens right here. So if you need an all-in-one lens, the 14-140mm might be your answer. However, again, the 14-100-40 is slightly larger, it is bulkier, it is heavier, it is a little bit more expensive than the 35-100. And also, sharpness at the telephoto focal length of this lens might not be as sharp as the 35-100mm. So just be mindful of that. Also, there are plenty of variations of 40-150mm lenses from Panasonic and Olympus that you might want to check out as an alternative to the 35-100mm lens. They will be slightly bulkier than the 35-100mm, but they are still small and they provide more reach than the 100mm on this lens, and they are also affordable. So make sure that you will check those guys out too. And that wraps up today's video. So that is all for today's video. I hope that today's video is useful for you. And also please comment down below what is your favorite telephoto lens. Also, if you have any question about this video, feel free to comment down below as well. Also, don't forget to support my channel by liking this video, sharing this video, and subscribing to my channel down below. Thank you and goodbye.